If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Okay, so I am today interviewing my mom, Marie Summers. I'm doing that because she is, in all likelihood, the living subject matter expert on the Nicholson Springs Hotel, which existed in the latter part of the 1800s into the early 1900s in Warren County, Tennessee. It was a resort hotel for people to come and, quote, take the waters. Episode 3 deals with this. This interview is a companion to that episode 3 on the Lost Resort, which is episode 3, Nicholson Springs Hotel, the Lost Resort. Make sure you go listen to that podcast. But this is some background information on that. And so, Mom, welcome to the show. We're sitting in your living room, so I guess it's a little odd that I say welcome to you. But wanted to talk through you with some things about the research you did. This, correct me if I'm wrong, this article that was in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, this was actually a research paper for you as you were working on your undergrad degree at Tennessee Tech back in the 1980s. This was published, if memory serves, fall of 1986.
I think that's right.
So, just want to get some insight from you about things like the people you talked to, about the kinds of research that you did. Obviously, all of this was pre-internet. So,
oh man, was it though?
So none of this happened, doing internet research. Interestingly, that article that we talked about is available now on the internet. Anybody can go out there and find that. And I'll have that link posted in the information for the episode itself and for this bonus material. But so tell me a little bit about how was it that you decided to do this particular topic? What was it that made you choose this as the subject of your research paper?
Well, I heard stories when I was a child and then growing up about it being down there, and it just fascinated me that such a thing could be that close to where we live. As the crow flies, probably maybe half a mile down to the river.
So it's
on this side
of the river. So yeah, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's probably 3/4 of a mile to a mile to the site. It's 3/4 of a mile to a mile to where that actual site was. And actually, when I think about it, it was on the same side of the river as we are, because the river takes a bend.
Yes.
Down below. So it was on the same side of the river, but where that site was, I believe.
All that's left now is just part of the foundation of one of the big buildings. They wound up expanding to 3 buildings, 3 main hotels buildings, and several, I can't remember the exact number, but several cottages. And they also expanded across the river with the dance pavilion and other things that they had going. They had so many things, riding and hiking and fishing and swimming and dancing, and they would take people back into McMinnville for shopping if they chose to do that. Just a lot of things to keep people occupied and remove the chance of boredom and the guests leaving and moving on. Most of the people, not all of them, but most of the people who were guests came and stayed 4 weeks, 6 weeks. They would just I interviewed Miss Henniger, Miss Mildred Henniger, and she was 89 when I talked with her. She told me about how her grandmother would get them out of Nashville every summer because they were afraid of cholera and typhoid fever, smallpox. They didn't have any idea what caused most of this stuff at the time. And people thought the heat of the cities and the congestion of people and breathing the night air with miasma, which they thought was carrying the diseases from one person to another. Anyway, they would come and stay every year for about 4 to 6 weeks at Nicholson Springs, and then they'd pack up and they'd go to Bushby Springs for the rest of the summer. I also interviewed Miss Elizabeth Danielson. She was 92 at the time that I interviewed her for this paper. She and Miss Hittiger both talked about the dance pavilion and how exciting it was every Saturday night to have a band playing. And there was a ballroom attached, built into the main hotel building. But this dance pavilion, they could be out in the night air and dancing and enjoying themselves. And I think there were a few love matches, if you will, made at those dances. Andy McGowan, another person that I interviewed, and he was...
I want to say he was 88.
He was 88. You're right, John. He was 88, and he talked about how not only did he attend the dances, but he talked about how his father had worked for Nicholson Springs. He grew up, well, I say he grew up. It started like in the mid-1880s and went to 1910. And his father was just, I think, a handyman, if you will, which led us in our conversations for me to tell him my story. My grandparents would my grandfather would fish, and he would take fresh fish and sell it to them. My grandmother made butter and sold butter to them on a regular basis, and any extra vegetables that she had from her garden that she didn't need for her family, she also sold those for a little bit of spending cash.
And for our listeners, let me kind of put this in perspective. And we were talking earlier about where we are right now. This house where we're sitting right now,
right,
is roughly 3/4 of a mile, maybe a mile to where the hotel stood. And the home of these two individuals that you're talking about, your grandparents, we're all of what we're on is you've got what's left of the old Shields farm. They lived about 150, 200 yards across the road from where we are. Their house is now the A&K Termite and Pest Control office. That's their old house. That's what is now used for that.
Yes.
And so people who may be in this part of the country, they can picture exactly what we're talking about then.
My grandfather inherited from his father 100 acres of the farm. And when he reached he passed away when he was 62. So not too long before that, well, back in 1958, actually, when Mother and Dad built this house, he divided up his 100 acres, 25 acres for each, generally speaking, for each of his 4 children. And I happened to be on the last 6 acres of that farm that has been in the Shields family for multiple generations.
Well, you talk about that you would be at least 4 generations there.
Right.
And so yeah, that's quite some time. But I'm just, going back to where I wanted to put this in perspective that your grandparents lived about a mile from where this was.
Yes, and it was no no problem to get those things that they were selling to the hotel, to get the produce and the butter and the fish there. And it was my understanding from my grandmother that the hotel was very excited and happy to be able to buy the produce and whatever that local farmers and merchants could bring. It made life a lot simpler for them not to have to go out and beat the bushes to get things for the table. And by the way, when this first started, it was known as Chris Springs Resort Hotel. When Dr. Ransom, he built it and kept it for a few years, and when he sold it to Miss Electa Nicholson, she changed the name from Chris Springs, which was the name of the community, and the cemetery and the little store.
And let me interrupt, if I may, just for a moment. Chris Springs Market is still there. It's at the intersection of Chris Springs Road
and Old Shelbyville.
And Old Shelbyville Highway there. And right across the Chris Springs Road from the store, it's a small bluff there, just a little ridge kind of thing, is where the Chris family cemetery is. And you know, I used to mow that when I was a kid because Mr. R.C. Smith and Mr. Spurgeon Lane had cleaned it out and cleaned it up for the first time in generations, and they used to have me mow that.
Well, there were no Crisp family descendants available to take care of it. So the people close by in the neighborhood took on the job of doing it and did it without any expectation of enumeration.
Right, and so not only not getting paid, it was basically pro bono, you might say. But where it's located, where that family cemetery is located, is only a few hundred yards to the north of where the hotel stood.
Right. And Dr. Ransom started it, as I said, he was planning to have it as a summertime hotel and a year-round sanitarium. That was the plan to begin with. That did not come to fruition, but he did expand. Believe it or not, it became, for the fact that no one remembers anything about it, so to speak, it became a really big thing in the area. People would come for Sunday night to take supper at Nicholson Springs.
At the hotel, at the restaurant.
Hotel restaurant. And it was, now all I can go by is the inserts in the Southern Standard and places like that I came across in my research. And believe me, by the way, turning that crank on that microfilm, I would get motion sickness and have to stop. But that was the only way to do it, that and to read microfiche, because you could not get your hands on the primary source itself. And that was one reason that it was so helpful to be able to interview
primary sources who
were not,
who were alive then.
Forgive me for saying this, but were not long for this world.
No.
At the time that I managed to talk with them. And they were so interesting, and just told me little tidbits of information that doesn't appear in any of the old standard articles.
Mm-hmm. So a question I have for you, and I'm sure that this is something that some of our listeners are going to want to know, And I don't know that you have the answer to this, and if you don't, that's okay. But you mentioned Miss Henniger and her grandmother would come and stay for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. This was not Motel 6. I mean, Tom Bodette, they might have been leaving the lights on for you, but it wasn't Tom Bodette. This was a relatively posh place.
Well, for our area, yes.
I mean, it wasn't the Waldorf, but
the what I consider ultra rich, the Astors and the Vanderbilts and their friends would go to places like Bar Harbor and
Martha's Vineyard and
yes, just up north and the very posh hotels. This was
upper middle class.
Upper middle class, doctors and teachers and lawyers and well-to-do merchants and their families, and it was a great boon, if you will, for Warren County. They looked upon this little area of the country as, nothing big, nothing great, just people living on their land and trying to farm. But to be able to support the merchants in McMinnville, to be able to keep the trains from Nashville to McMinnville,
which, by the way, would have required going the spur line from Tullahoma. They would have taken the main trunk line that went from Nashville to Chattanooga and would pass through Tullahoma. They would have then taken a spur line from there that went up to McMinnville. They would have gotten off at Smart.
Right.
Which was only 2 or 3 miles
right.
from...
2.5, 3 miles the way they went. Now, the way we go to Smart Station now is much farther around, but they would take wagons two or three times a day. They would meet trains as they came in, and they took wagons not only for the people to have a place to ride over in, but they could stack their luggage. And believe me, they had quite some amount of luggage for that amount of time.
Well, they would have had to, and they probably were bringing the big steamer trunk type things.
Right.
If your idea of a good weekend includes a fishing rod, a boat, a campsite, and a Tennessee sunset over the water, then you need to check out Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on scenic Kentucky Lake on the beautiful Tennessee River, just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, Birdsong is conveniently located halfway between Memphis and Nashville. Family-owned and welcoming guests since 1961, Birdsong is now operated by the second generation of the Keast family, and whether you're looking for cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, or easy lake access, Birdsong has you covered. Be sure to visit the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll find Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call, tell them Big John sent you. So where I was going with all of this is, do you remember from your research, and you may not now, what would this have cost?
Okay, it started out something like $1.50 a day. Now, folks, we're not talking about just a place to sleep. That would include their food, their entertainment. It was from $150 to $250 a day, and the upper price for the rooms depended upon the location of the rooms in the hotel, which We still do that, do we not? And
Well, yeah, the penthouse suite obviously is the most expensive.
so it became a little more expensive as time went on, and it became more famous. But they could accommodate up to 225 people. Now, for a little burg like Chris Springs, to have a building or buildings ample enough in size to accommodate 225 people overnight. Now, that's not counting the people who came just to eat and then
Sure.
go back to McMinnville or go back home, wherever. It made for a nice date for a young man to be able to take a girl. And by the way, when on these trips where they came out from McMinnville, they were highly chaperoned. It was all very, very above board. But
We're talking Victorian era here. Things were quite a bit different in that.
But that doesn't mean that there weren't a few stolen kisses and people holding hands and such, and even dancing. And for what I consider a conservative community, not ultra conservative as it probably once was, but even at that time, it was still moderately conservative. There didn't seem to be a fuss made about dancing, which I found to be surprising.
Mm-hmm.
To hear Miss Danielson talk about how she would get ready and how excited she'd be, and Miss Henniger talking about being there for 4 to 6 weeks at a time and getting a chance on every Saturday night to go to the dance. Now, Mr. McGowan also went to the dances. He was not as open to discussion about them the way the ladies were, but you would have thought I was talking to two 16-year-old girls when they remember.
They were.
At the time, yes,
And
they were.
They at that that conjured up those memories, and so that's what they were at the time that they were happening.
Now, while I'm thinking about it, let me throw in here, when I talk about the dance pavilion, it wasn't just used for dancing. They had well-known preachers come and do sermons, and the sermons were highly attended from what I'm able to understand from people who were there at the time. It wasn't just a religious ceremony. It became part of the societal.
Well, to kind of put some context around that, what we're talking about in that time period is it wasn't so much out of the spirit of ecumenicism as it was the only source of I won't say entertainment, but to some degree I guess it was. Certainly from the standpoint of something for a social event. It was a social event. And so it didn't matter what denomination they were; it would be attended by everybody in the community. And of course, remembering we were talking about it as we began, you couldn't do your research on the internet because the internet didn't exist yet. Radio, stereos, recorded music, television, movies, all of the things that we think of today as being our sources of entertainment, none of that existed. So, if you were going to have music, it was live music. If you were going to have a speaker, it was a live speaker. There was not the ability to listen to it later. There was not the ability. You had to be there in person for it. So, people gathered for that. Am I correct?
That is the point that I started to make when I said that these dances were highly chaperoned. There was never any open drinking. The hotel, as far as, for all intents and purposes, did not sell alcoholic beverages. That doesn't mean you couldn't get it under the counter. The way it makes me think of back in the day when books that were of questionable integrity, the library would have them many times, but they were not on the shelf. You had to ask for the book, and then they wrote it down somewhere that you had read such and such a book. I remember when Peyton Place came out, it was, we didn't know that it was going to become part of our general vocabulary. You can say, well, that's just a little Peyton Place, and everybody knows what you mean. Now, the liquor question, many people brought their own, knowing that it was going to be difficult to obtain it otherwise. But the moonshiners, now there were moonshiners, and there was a local moonshiner that I think they were able to buy the liquor from.
So to put this also in context, and I don't know how far back this goes. I don't know if this started with the Prohibition Amendment or if it was even before that. But I can remember it's only been in recent memory, the last few years, that Warren County was not a dry county. I mean, you couldn't buy liquor anywhere in the county. You couldn't even buy beer for a lot of years in the county.
Well, Warren County was a dry county. I don't know. I think it may have started back in the days of Susan B. Anthony and Carrie.
I can't think of her name, but yeah, the one that would go in
and break up the bars.
Yeah, with an axe. And, yeah. She was crazy.
It may have started then, but I suspect it was back even before that. But Warren County was a dry county, and people brought their own for that reason.
Okay, and that makes sense. I mean, they could not. The point being, it wasn't necessarily that they chose not to serve alcohol. Legally, they couldn't serve alcohol.
Right.
I mean, it was because it was a dry county where they were located.
But it was also things that they were able to do without the community voicing disapproval. They did because for two reasons. One, they were very discreet about how they did it. They didn't they didn't step over the line, if you will.
Right.
And the other thing was, this generated a great deal of income. You have to stop and think of how many people were employed by the hotel at the height of the season. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had gardeners, you had handymen, you had maids, you had people to do laundry, you had cooks, and all of these people generally came from the community and were getting paid for their labor. So as long as it was not up in your face, so to speak,
it was winked at,
they turned their heads slightly, I guess you might say, to keep food on their table. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting time. I hated it that it burned before I was born, actually. About sometime in the 30s, the 1930s. I think the last year that they were open for business as a hotel was maybe 1910. And after that, the buildings were just more or less abandoned. People who needed some wood to finish out maybe a shed or a chicken house, they would come get it there. It was already milled and planed, and all they had to do was carry it home. Then, during the Depression years, transients, hobos, tramps, sometimes even fishermen who wanted to stay overnight to be able to be there early in the morning would stay, but they really don't know what caused the fire, but it burned to the ground, what was left of it. So, all this.
So I think the word is spolia that you're talking about, where you rob previous structures to build a new structure. We see it a lot in Europe, for example, where they tear down old Roman buildings to build, buildings in the medieval years, because the stone was already quarried. Those kinds of things. If you enjoy the stories we tell each week and would like to show your support, I'd like to invite you to check out the Summers Media Enterprises merchandise store. You'll find shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, and other items featuring both the Tennessee History Nerd and Dauphin Island Diaries. This month's featured item is one of my personal favorites, our I Break for Historical Markers bumper stickers. Whether you're the kind of person who can't drive past a historical marker without pulling over, or you simply appreciate a good piece of history, it's a fun way to let everyone know you're always on the lookout for the next great story. To browse the entire collection, just visit the link in the show notes or visit the Summers Media Enterprises website. Every purchase helps to support the work that goes into researching, producing, and sharing these stories each week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our podcasts. And now let's get back into the story. So I was going to ask, and I think you may have already answered this, but just to be clear, there were a lot of buildings. There were three main buildings. On the bluff, plus cottages. And then on the opposite side of the river, you had the pavilion and other associated buildings that were there. So what was it actually that burned in the 30s? How was there only? I mean, what was even left at the point when it burned? Were some of those buildings already completely gone?
It's my understanding that the cottages were gone completely before this. The main hotel buildings were still, at least partially, still in, don't know the word, they were
still standing, still
standing, and still able to shelter.
Still sound.
Thank you. We're still sound enough that the place to have had such a marvelous name throughout the South, not just in Middle Tennessee, but throughout the South especially, because we were the ones that had to put up with the hot summers and the diseases that seemed to wreak havoc during the summers. To have had such a great reputation at one time, by the 1930s, it had become it had a really bad name because of the types of people that tended to still use it.
But it was no longer a business at that point. It was
no longer a business, no. Now, they had a point that I don't think we made, is that when Dr. Ransom first started the hotel, they did not have indoor plumbing of any sort. Now, about 1892, somewhere along in there, maybe 6 or 7 years after he started it, they put in indoor plumbing. They also had telephone lines to Nashville and other places. I guess they were direct lines. They had a telegraph. They had a post office that was active even after the hotel itself closed. The Chris Springs, it went back to Chris Springs, and the Chris Springs post office was still active, well, up until, I'd say just before World War II, maybe.
Okay. I did not know that. That's interesting. So, something that you had talked about with me previously that I think is kind of relevant here with what we're talking about. Was it still owned by Miss Nicholson at the point where the business was abandoned? I know she had tried to sell it multiple times.
That's kind of an interesting story. Dr. Ransom sold it to her, and she also had the Nicholson House Hotel in Nashville, which later became known as the Tulane Hotel. It was on the corner of Church, I want to say Church and 8th, what became Church and 8th Street. It also catered to the middle class. From the looks of the picture that I was able to come up with, it looked like it might have been catering to the lower middle class. It was not a spiffy hotel, if you will. But she sold it. Miss Nicholson sold it to a doctor from up north, but she retained a trust deed, is what they called it. She sold that thing 3 different times, and each time that she sold it, the person who bought it would not manage to pay their installments of the note or the loan, and she would take it back over and run it for a little while herself.
You're talking about this hotel here, not the one in Nashville.
Yes, I'm talking, but she had the one in Nashville at the same time,
right,
which made it a burden,
a challenge for her. Yes,
to carry both of them. So she tried to sell it. She took it back. She sold it again. She took it back. I think she sold it again, and she wound up taking it back and finally deciding she wasn't going to be able to sell it. All she wanted to do was get it off her hands, where since she died in, I think it was 1890, she may have been having health problems that she did not want people to know about, but she divided it equally between 2 of her nephews. She had no children of her own, so she just deeded it over to the 2 nephews. Well, one of the nephews had worked as a clerk or a reception
concierge type.
Yes, already. The other one was inexperienced in that, but he wound up being the one that ran the business, so to speak, and the other nephew took care of the business within the hotel with the guests.
Operations, you might say.
Yes. By 1910, they had completely lost it as far as, well, crowds started thinning out prior to World War One. They started, things were coming about that we take for granted now. Movies were starting to be popular, whether they were speakies or not. People would flock to them. There were other things that caught people's fancy, and and another thing, they had come up with a lot of the medical. They came up with the medical explanations for the illnesses when people were no longer afraid to stay in cities because of the threat of disease, when they found out that cholera could be controlled. Smallpox. Jenner had come up with smallpox antiviral injections. Just, they didn't have to fear for their lives, so they found other things to occupy them, and they didn't. The crowds just kept getting smaller and smaller, and it was not necessarily, I don't think, it was not necessarily poor business acumen that caused the hotel to fail. I think it was at least a 3 or 4 level thing that just made it difficult to cover everything.
So basically, it was a perfect storm of circumstances.
Right. So.
And it would not have been, Red Boiling Springs managed to remain relevant. It reinvented itself, more or less. Of course, we know, as we're talking about this in January of 2026, it was, I think, in November of 2025 that the Donahoe in Red Boiling Springs burned, and it had been there for, decades, hundreds of years, over 100 years.
1920s, I think.
Yeah, so like 100 years. So, that time period, they had managed to reinvent themselves. The location of where we're talking about here would have been difficult for them to reinvent themselves in the same way.
I don't think I touched on this, and I think we should. One of the reasons that, in fact, it was the primary reason that Dr. Ransom chose the location he did, was because of the springs, the natural springs that flowed freely. There was red sulfur that, from what I understand, would curl your hair if you needed it. A milder form of sulfur water called white sulfur, and then the free waters that was the term that they used for the, I think it was pronounced chalybeate or something of that
limestone.
It was water like we drink now. And he actually built or maybe Miss Nicholson built a cover over the springs. But it was not just a hotel. It was more, I think I said something about the sanitarium idea, but it became almost like a spa. And it was because of the waters. Now, not only have the hotel buildings all disappeared over time, the waters that came out of those 3 springs have stopped. And
as the water table has dropped.
We think the water table dropped. My husband put forth the thought that it could have been maybe a farmer around on the other side of the hill that tapped into something that caused the springs to dry up.
Well, let me point out that we're talking about just a very few yards from where the springs once were, where the intake for West Warren goes into the Barren Fork River now.
Right.
So, right. I mean, when I say it's probably no more than 100 yards between where it comes in now and where the springs once were.
So It causes me dismay to think that if you stop somebody in this community and ask them, how do I get to Nicholson Springs where the old hotel used to be? They couldn't tell you.
Most people couldn't.
Most people in this community, it's a forgotten.
Well, in the thing too, and the community. You had the hotel. You're only from where the hotel was. At most, a mile north of there was where the Granger's Hall was. And it's where Grange Hall Church is now, but there was a school there. The cemetery is still there. But that's where the Grangers met, and that was a big deal in the late 1800s,
Right.
as well. So I mean, you're looking at a time when this particular community was much more important in the fabric of Warren County than perhaps it is now.
And many people, if you ask them, what was a Granger? They have no idea. But the farmers supported that. And I don't know that they voted in block on things, but that was the general idea.
Basically, the Grangers, to put it in terms that people would understand today, they were a union for the farmers.
A labor union, more or less, for the farmers.
And so it enabled them to negotiate prices with the railroads for shipping their produce. But a lot of people don't realize this. The Grangers are one way that we've got rural free delivery of mail now. Mm-hmm. That was something that came out of the Granger movement, and it originated in the Midwest, in Iowa, the Dakotas, in that area, but it became big throughout the entire country. Anywhere that there was an agrarian type of community, and that was true here in Warren County.
Well, we have the church and the cemetery, and as far as I know, the old log schoolhouse is still over there.
It is still over there. But the log schoolhouse is what had been previously the Granger meeting
hall, and they would meet in the evenings when there were no classes, and then school would be grades 1 through 8. My dad graduated.
I was going to say your father went to school there. And
my
uncles.
father graduated from, he had to walk to school to Grange Hall, but he knew a shortcut. It wasn't as far around as to go by the road as we would go today. But he graduated from the 8th grade, and that was his education. His sister was the only one of the 4 children. He had 2 brothers and a sister. They all attended Grange Hall School, but Aunt Jenny she knew relatives that would let her stay with them, and she went to school. She graduated from McMinnville Central, but she's the only one that had a high school education. But now, that doesn't mean an 8th grade education in those days was pretty much the equivalent of a general 4-year high school education nowadays, and maybe a little college thrown in.
Yeah, there was a lot of additional things that were taught in those days. Of course, Aunt Jenny's story also relates to what I'll be doing in another episode with Camp Forest.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because Uncle Ted was a soldier at Camp Forest in Tullahoma. So.
Well, she met him because they were over here on the fields doing maneuvers on the field right next to where she lived in the house. And she met him, and they eloped to Ringgold, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And then she moved to Ohio when he got out of the Army.
If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story. So, going back to the story with Nicholson Springs, you mentioned that there was some tragedy involved.
Yes, it pretty much did Dr. Ransom in as far as his initiative to continue running Chris Springs. When he had it, it was Chris Springs. His brother had a son, and Dr. Ransom had a son. Those were the only two children of the family. The boys grew up together and were like brothers. And one night in Walter's house, he and William were playing cards and drinking. And from the stories that I've been able to pull up and get any kind of veracity to, they were both pretty well drunk. They had an argument, got into a fight, and Walter shot and killed William. Now, Dr. Ransom...
Which William and Walter were the sons? Which was which?
William was the son of Joseph, Dr. Ransom's brother. Walter was Dr. Ransom's son. Joseph, Dr. Ransom's brother, and William's father knew how close those boys were, and knew that had he been in control of himself and not drunk, Walter would never have done such a thing. So he refused to swear out a warrant for murder against his brother's son, with the understanding that Walter would leave and not come back to the area. He didn't feel, while he understood the situation, he didn't feel that he could bear, or his other children could bear, to see Walter in a social situation. For that reason, Joseph and his family never came to Chris Springs or Nicholson Springs, as it became. Walter left and went to Texas, as it seemed that many were prone to do in those days. Some of my early relations, my kin, if you will, wound up doing that. My great-grandfather's older brother went to Texas to avoid
prosecution
for statutory rape, which he was dating a girl who was younger than he was, not much, just a year, but he was an adult by law and she wasn't. And it was not something that became a forced situation on their part. They would have married had her family been willing for her to marry him, but they were not. So he left for Texas, and he didn't come.
What was his name?
I want to say Andrew Gilbert. But Joseph allowed Walter to leave and go to Texas. Walter would come back occasionally to see his family, but he would do it at the hotel and he wouldn't be out and about in the community. He would just come to the hotel and then catch the train at Smart Station and go back. But it devastated not only Joseph, but Dr. Ransom, Walter's father, and he more or less lost his zeal that he had to make the hotel a success. So he sold it.
So one of the terms that you used earlier was sanitarium, and that's not a word that we use very much nowadays. I know that Falcon Manor was it later it was built as a mansion, but it later became a hospital and sanitarium. The term it applies to a place. A lot of times it was used to treat consumption with tuberculosis.
Yes. Did not know how that it took a long time for them to figure out how tuberculosis was transmitted and then to come up with a treatment for it. Once they came up with the treatment for it, you hear of a resurgence of tuberculosis with underdeveloped countries, and if they come as, I hate to use the term aliens, but immigrants, thank you, to America, many times they bring tuberculosis with them. I have even heard of people catching, I hate to be an naysayer, but on a plane, because the air is just circulated and everybody gets to breathe everybody else's air. But the sanitarium idea was not just for tuberculosis, and they did not know what caused tuberculosis. They knew what the symptoms were. And many times, being in a cooler, drier environment, the way it would be at Crisp Springs. And by the way, Dr. Ransom, when he had it, was the live-in physician the whole summer that the hotel was in operation. He was there as the live-in doctor to take care of things. So people had other ailments. The waters were supposed to cure just about anything anybody had. They didn't, but people thought they helped them, and in many cases that was part of the battle.
Well, it's kind of like the patent medicine salesman of the time.
And that was a big deal at the time. There was a lot of patent medicine out there, and Dr. Ransom said he would rather treat his patients with natural methods like sulfur water and maybe bathing, and it was a spa as well as a hotel and a sanitarium. It covered a lot of territory, but his methods didn't include alcohol the way the patent medicine
were normally basically moonshine. So also with the sanitarium, you see that also used a lot of times, and it just depends on how that particular sanitarium was organized to run. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but for the treatment of mental illness.
Not so much for this.
Exactly.
One of the things that comes to mind that the waters treated and did seem to help was dyspepsia, stomach problems, heartburn. It maybe the beginning of an ulcer. It took care. It did help that, and it helped some other things. Skin problems. If you had eczema, or there were other names for it back then, but if you had skin problems, you could bathe daily in this red sulfur water, excuse me, and it seemed to help. Most of the people that came, many of them met there every year and knew each other. So it was not like going into a hotel nowadays cold turkey. Well, it's not cold turkey, but cold.
So something I can probably give as an example that, from a popular cultural standpoint, that would come to mind. You saw some of the same kinds of things happening in the Adirondacks and those areas,
Catskills.
and the Catskills. And so when you see the movie Dirty Dancing, kind of the same concept there, where they were doing that every year. They would go for a period of a few weeks every year. What was it they called it? The Borscht Circuit.
Yeah.
So you saw a lot of those folks doing that year over year, and that was probably 40 or 50 years after the time period that we're talking about here. That was still going on there.
Dirty Dancing supposedly was set in 1962. So you're right, it came considerably later, but it is the same concept. They would go and stay for multiple weeks, and they got room and board and entertainment all at the same place. So
So we've been talking now for quite a while, and I want to be respectful of where you are. So how do you feel like we've covered really the things that you had wanted to talk about in the course of this, or are there things that you still would like to bring out?
No, I think we've hit most of them.
Okay.
I didn't stress, although I did mention, I didn't stress that about the telephone lines and the telegraph. They had to have an actual telegrapher to take care of the telegraphs.
Who knew Morse code and could transmit and receive.
The postmaster at one time was, I believe, Dr. Ransom's nephew, and then and it was Chris Springs then, when Miss Nicholson took over and changed it to Nicholson Springs, the post office was Nicholson Springs / Chris Springs, I think.
Okay.
Just because people had come to associate Chris Springs with the name, and I can understand why she would want to change it to her name, but it did cause some
consternation.
Yes, I think we've fairly well covered it.
Well, let me say a few things then as we close up. Then, first of all, let me say thank you for this, because I know this was something that you weren't planning when you heard that I was doing the podcast. So really appreciate you doing this. And by the way, this is, for the listeners, this is the first interview that I'm doing. So, I've been able to impose upon my own mother for the first of the interviews. There'll be already, I've got several lined up for other episodes. So there's going to be many more coming. But I do want to say thank you for doing this, and I found it really interesting. I think a lot of people are going to find this interesting, especially considering the fact that this doesn't exist anymore, and it hasn't existed in over a century. So,
well, one thing that I didn't, and you can cut this out if you want, but one thing that we didn't talk about in great detail was the fact that, how did I have access to the microfilm and the microfiche? On Thursdays, back in the day, Magnus Library was closed on Thursdays. I guess my reputation was good enough to get me in. I was able to go in on Thursdays and use the microfilm machine and the microfiche without supervision of any kind. I always put things back the way I found them.
Well, during that same time period, you and I had done some volunteer work.
Yes, and Melissa especially.
Melissa as well. Melissa was a little bit later, but I mean, and the librarian then was Miss Cheryl Priest.
That's right. I didn't mention her name because I didn't know whether I should or not, because actually I don't know that she should have allowed me to do what I did.
I think the statute of limitations probably applies here.
Well, maybe that'll take care of it. But she was a sweetie, and she trusted me, which was a great reason for me to make sure that nothing inappropriate happened. No microfilm tapes were broken or anything, which is amazing considering how old some of them were. I was able to go back and look for Southern Standard entries, which I found quite interesting.
Let me interrupt just for a second. You've mentioned that already in the course of the conversation. For our listeners, many of whom are not from this area, the Southern Standard, for many years, it was the local newspaper for probably 150 years in Warren County and McMinnville.
There were others, but none lasted the way the Southern Standard did. And Rayford Davis from the Southern Standard, do you want me to talk about that? Rayford Davis from the Southern Standard, who was a reporter, somehow found out that my article had been published in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, which, by the way, I don't know if we mentioned that it was an assignment for all the people in the junior class. All of us had to come up with the topic and write a paper and submit it. The persons whose paper was chosen to be the best was awarded a scholarship for their senior year for expenses of tuition and books. It happened that mine was chosen to be the best, and I got that scholarship. And I also, the chairman of the history department, since I was a history major, I think he submitted I didn't submit my paper to the quarterly. Dr. Jones, who has since passed away and cannot defend himself, submitted my paper, and it was published. And getting back to Rayford Davis, he found out about it and came out and made pictures of what was left of where the hotel was, the old foundation that was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Bernice Pope took us down. He owned the land at the time, and he took us down and pointed out where the springs had been, and he was quite interested in that since he owned the land. But Rayford Davis, I guess, gave me big-time billing in the Standard when he reported coming out and showed the pictures that he made and published my paper completely in the Southern Standard, which, if you didn't get the quarterly, a lot of people who were not familiar with Nicholson Springs or the quarterly, people in Warren County were able to read about it from Rayford Davis's reporting.
I want to say thank you for the time. Thank you for talking about all this, because you brought out things that I wouldn't be able to bring out in the course of the episode from the research that I've done. And primary source for that is your paper, obviously, but there's some other sources as well. But I do appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you having the wherewithal to do the report on Nicholson Springs, so maybe it will not be forgotten. That was the reason I agreed to do the interview. I was hopeful that people will be able, maybe at least in some circles, if you say, "Did you ever hear of Nicholson Springs Hotel?" Why, yes.
Well, and that's actually one of the reasons I'm doing the podcast. There are stories I want to make sure don't die.
That is exactly the reason I did this.
So,
And I thank you for asking me. I was highly flattered, but I was anxious also. But I'm so glad we did it.
I am too. Thank you so much. Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening.